Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to come here today. I always love hearing Jean-Christophe's presentations because the International Migration Outlook is my reference book each year. Not only does it present the most accurate data, but it presents it in a way that is useful for policymakers to really understand the dynamics. Sometimes people use data in a very basic way that serves to underline a point that they wish to make rather than thinking about how to challenge some of the policy assumptions. And that's one thing I think should really be taken away from that book in particular. I'm going to focus on the refugee crisis in particular, in part because it's been a major part of the work of MPI Europe over the last 2 years. And I realize the crisis for many people has only really emerged in the last 6 months, but for us, 2 years ago, we were talking to policymakers about how this was coming. And most of them said, no, we're fine. We'll just implement the policies we have. It's going to be fine. And now we find ourselves in a very different situation. So we've been thinking and talking about how to manage this for quite some time. And I think one of the key points to note is that this is not a single crisis. This is the result of several overlapping crises. And I don't just mean in terms of one single conflict or several conflicts. I mean different types of crisis that throw up different policy challenges. First and foremost, it's a foreign policy crisis. We're seeing proliferating instability in the European neighborhood. Our minds go to Syria, but also we need to now look at Afghanistan and Iraq. We need to look at Yemen. We need to start wondering about the stability in other countries like Egypt, even in Libya, and the sustainability of that, and what might be coming down the pipeline. And I completely agree with Jean-Christophe's point about really needing to do better assessment and early warning and knowledge management about what we might see in 1, 2, 3 years' time. Most of the experts in the field of refugee policy knew that this moment was coming, perhaps not the exact month, but we all knew it was going to happen around now. So how did that not then translate into a preparedness response 6 to 12 months ago? And we should really be asking those hard questions because the foreign policy crisis has created, as we see now, a refugee crisis with numbers rising globally as well as within the European neighborhood. And this combines with long-term difficulties in managing an existing refugee population around the world, where an increasing proportion of refugees and those displaced around the world are displaced for long periods of time. Protracted situations and the absence of durable solutions for a vast majority of those people mean that we are capable of increasing our refugee populations. We are less capable of reducing them. And that is now coming home to roost in the European neighborhood. For Europe specifically, it's also a migration management crisis. These are mixed flows towards the European Union. These are not new mixed flows towards the European Union, but they have been made acute by the nature of the refugee crisis in the European neighborhood. So in some ways, the European Union is trying to understand how to better do triage at the European borders at a moment of crisis and large numbers arriving at particular pressure points at the external borders and struggling to manage who is in need of protection, who is not, and then what is step 2. And this in turn has created an existential crisis for EU systems themselves. It has long been known, and I know for a fact that Jean's often bemoaned this, that these systems are dysfunctional. Unfinished systems within the European Union to manage asylum, unfinished immigration systems, including the Schengen system, are always going to be unsustainable and will be dysfunctional. But we were capable of ignoring it until this year. We can no longer ignore that. And unfortunately, now we're also seeing all of these overlapping crises now overlaid by security concerns and the realization that the absence of robust identification and the management of flows may pose an additional threat to the European Union in terms of either lone wolf or organized terrorism. So the European Union member states are facing multiple challenges in a context of overstretched systems, limited resources, and increasingly hostile domestic politics, and now the increased salience of security concerns. That's not a job description I would take on. But what we're seeing right now, and I think the priorities for policy that Jean-Christophe has really set out are important to understand, and I think we all understand that these are the key things that we need to address. It's not just one aspect, it's many different aspects simultaneously. What we are struggling with is not that we don't know what to do, but we don't necessarily know how to do it. Currently, there is no single vision within the European Union about how policy should develop, but rather 28 different visions, which has led to paralysis at the European Union level with respect to sustainable development of policy. And as a result of this paralysis, we're seeing EU member states resorting backwards into unilateral decision-making based in part on their domestic policy concerns, political concerns, but the need to ensure their national systems can be maintained. And I think what we've seen in Sweden over the last couple of weeks is a tragic but completely foreseeable outcome of a country that has tried to do its best in an absence of solidarity from other EU member states. As I have heard Swedish policymakers say time and time again, we could have done this if everyone else had done what we did. We could have all done this, but being left on our own has been unsustainable, and now we're having to reassess our own position. And this has consequences, I think, for our willingness to protect as a whole within the European Union. The crisis has also forced the EU to act in ways it's not acted before, as a geopolitical actor, but also as an operational actor, not just one mandated to create legislative proposals and maintain standards. And the EU is acting at a faster pace than ever before, though it's not necessarily visible from outside Brussels. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the pace. Current EU thinking is headed in two fairly short-term, though necessary directions. The first is to slow down the numbers arriving at the European borders and to address the chaos that in and of itself, regardless of numbers involved, is reducing public confidence across the European Union. Plan A is to do this through Turkey, through a deal that remains incomplete and potentially Faustian in the longer term. Plan B is to triage flows at the Greek-Macedonian border, which we are seeing, and we're also seeing the distressing images that accompany a decision to thwart the very deeply entrenched desires of individuals to reach particular destinations in a context where the resources to then manage that population that has been thwarted are not necessarily there. The resources on the ground are missing. The second way in which the EU is looking to address this is a reform of the Dublin system that we will see towards the end of this year and the beginning of next year, and an institutionalization of the emergency relocation proposals, which are still concepts yet to be proved sustainable. So what we're seeing is mostly stopgap measures, and the challenges faced with the operationalization of relocation and questions towards its long-term sustainability suggests to me that this isn't going to be a sustainable long-term policy. So I want to focus on a couple of things that I think were raised also in the OECD presentation that we'll need to think about more deeply in the coming months, and for which we will need to draw lessons from the recent past. First, as I said, unfinished systems are unsustainable, and the EU finds itself questioning whether to move forward and shore up those systems that have become familiar and valuable, particularly Schengen, or to revert to national systems entirely. This is the question I'm asked by every journalist every single day: will Schengen survive? There is much confusion about what this means, and I think the development of a Visegrad 4 who claim to be friends of Schengen and defending the Schengen space while absolutely refusing any other aspects of solidarity demonstrates the fact that Schengen is not a disconnected idea. Schengen has to walk hand in hand with common ideas about asylum and immigration and a certain level of commonality across the European Union. So we really have to think that if we are going to shore up these systems, it has to be done along all aspects. Assuming, as I tend to do, that the costs of losing Schengen are too high, not just politically, but financially, reinstating border infrastructure at internal borders across the EU is not something that overstretched EU member states can seriously consider in the long term. We should then ask ourselves, what is an end game for a sustainable common European asylum system, thinking beyond the crisis we see now, but trying to think out 5-10 years. There are a core group of member states who are coming up with ideas along various different lines and thinking about a fundamental overhaul of the way we think about asylum. On the one hand, resettlement is emerging as a way of managing flows rather than continuing with high levels of spontaneity and chaos at the European borders. If we can already resettle those in most need of protection, can we reduce flows towards the European Union? But also, how do we manage those flows at the European border? Should we really consider fast-track systems and transit processing, as was raised within the German debate a few months ago? Should we in the future really consider the viability of developing and maintaining 28 separate asylum systems with all the duplication that implies? Or should we seriously invest in the kinds of economies of scale, whether that be pooled reception facilities, joint processing, or other means to create not just commonality in principle, but commonality in practice and savings for countries that are going to have to invest deeply, not just in asylum management, but integration over the next decade? And I think the investment question that was thrown up in the presentation highlights serious questions that we should have about the investment choices that need to be made. It is one thing to understand how much it will cost. It's another thing to understand how to prioritize it. We're seeing a number of countries cutting development and humanitarian aid in favor of being able to protect the numbers who are coming already to the European Union and making that choice between the internal and the external. This may end up being a short-term measure, as if there continues to be a funding shortfall for the protection of those who are in the region of origin, which remain the majority of refugees around the world, we will see more of those people looking to self-relocate, as it were, and find their way to find better opportunities elsewhere. What we're working with are contextually small budgets within a migration management system that don't necessarily address the fundamentals. We talk about the root causes. I'm a skeptic. It's a generational activity. We should be aware of that. But we should understand how development and other aid can be used to support displaced populations and make them economically sustainable where they are, and not just within the European Union. Can we make investments in third countries to build protection capacity, and do we do enough follow-up? The European Union has invested millions over the last decade in increasing protection capacity in neighbourhood countries, and yet has requested very, very little verification that any of that capacity now exists. And the geopolitics of some of our funding decisions should be really critiqued. In promising Turkey $3 billion, have we created a baseline now for other countries to request additional funding? I personally don't find it a coincidence that the Pakistani government returned several readmitted migrants over the last month. I think they would also like more money. If they see it's on offer for Turkey, why shouldn't there be more money on the table for Pakistan as well? And this is an echo of the transactional approach the EU has so far taken towards cooperation with third countries. We will pay you to do what we ask you to do. Well, the cost is now going to get exponentially higher, so we have to think about the implications of that when even the $3 billion for Turkey doesn't yet exist. But we should also look at how investments are used effectively, and I won't go into detail here because I think Jean covered that in great detail in terms of who should we be spending this money on. Are national governments necessarily the best people to be spending integration funding? Do they know how best to spend it, or do local authorities and non-governmental actors have a stronger understanding of where the needs are and how to more effectively utilize those investments? And finally, I think on the investment side, a very serious question about translating emergency funding into resources. And this should be something that the EU deeply reflects on in the next few months. The fact that conditions are still so poor in the Greek islands and at other points along the Western Balkans, despite the provision of emergency funding months ago, leads us to really question whether there is an effectiveness in the chain of funding that goes down to national governments and then reaches localities. How do you actually translate finances into resources on the ground? We haven't answered this question, and it should raise some thoughts for EU actors about whether there should be an EU-held capacity and EU-held resources that can be dispersed, rather than relying either on national governments having the bureaucratic capacity to translate those resources, which countries such as Greece and in the Western Balkans don't necessarily have, but also relying on other EU member states donating resources through the civil protection mechanism and other types of mechanisms. But finally, I think we also need to look much more deeply at the foreign policy question. As I said, the transactional approach that's been adopted by the European Union, I think, is unsustainable. We have a European Action Service that is still at the bottom end of a very, very steep learning curve to understand how to incorporate migration into its daily activities. And at the national level, really thinking about national level coordination between ministries. Most ministries of foreign affairs don't talk on a regular basis with their counterparts in the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Employment. But if this crisis has shown us anything, it's that policy coherence is going to be absolutely key for successful for outcomes, both for refugees and for countries themselves. There will have to be more thought, not just in coordination, but the coherence of policies that are then adopted. As we've mentioned before, the role of resettlement will become increasingly important. But while we all talk about resettlement and legal channels, very little thought is given to actually how to then do that. The European Union is a nascent actor in the resettlement game. Very few countries currently undertake resettlement, and very few of them undertake it at scale. So we have a huge amount of learning to do, both in terms of operationally, how do you manage resettlement programs, but also scaling up across the European Union and working with other actors, such as UNHCR, who do much of the pre-work that goes into resettlement. So while we talk about all these legal channels, and most agencies and most actors, including ourselves, have really talked about how we need legal channels, what do we need operationally to get those done? What does design look like? And that's the next phase. And just this morning, MPI Europe published a paper looking at private sponsorship as an innovative model that's been pioneered by the Canadian government to bring private actors into the resettlement process and try to defray some of the costs of resettlement by bringing other actors in. And I would encourage you to read the paper, which I always would. And finally, really thinking about this, pulling back out to the fact that this is a global protection crisis and that other countries are involved. Over the next year, we will see a proliferation of international discussions regarding responsibility sharing on a global basis in 2016, including a global compact on responsibility sharing that will likely take place in the second half of next year. So in a context where the existing global protection infrastructure is struggling to adapt to the realities of displacement today, and an increasing number of people are left in a legal limbo that is economically unsustainable for them, and in terms of protection, very insecure, the EU needs to participate in these international discussions, but it also needs to show leadership and be aware that the choices they make, the choices the European Union makes, both positive and negative, over the next 6 to 12 months, will have a resounding impact, not just within the European Union, but in terms of those global discussions.